Hello, Poly 347 students. I hope everyone is doing well. This is our second online lecture. Today we're going to be getting at a topic which really gets at the meat of the course. I would argue that right now migration is the single most important and the single most salient issue that unites the three countries of North America. So we will look at how North America's migration regime has developed over time, and particularly since NAFTA was implemented, and we'll look at a number of very important ongoing issues in migration. We'll talk a little bit on top of Canada, the United States, and Mexico. We'll get into a little bit of the countries in the Northern Triangle of Central America, and a number of their travails with migration and their current challenges at the southern borders of both Mexico and the United States. So we'll pivot a little bit today into Central America, which we'll continue on over the next few weeks. Let's get started. So today we are going to focus on the concepts of migrants and migration. So when we talk about a migrant, that's a broad category comprising any individual whose nationality does not coincide with the country that they're currently inhabiting. So migrants come in a number of different categories and forms with varying degrees of legal protection. These can include tourists, immigrants, guest workers, refugees, and asylum seekers, as well as undocumented or illegal aliens. So you kind of have a continuum from levels of privilege to not privileged. There are currently about 250,000 migrants in the world today, including myself, Raheem. So I'm a Canadian citizen who currently takes up residence in the United States. I'm one of the 250,000 migrants currently in the world. So we still live, despite the rhetoric and the politics surrounding globalization, we still live in a state-centric world. We still live in a world in which most individual rights and most individual freedoms are attached to citizenship in a given country. And you have, under a few global protocols and a few global norms, a limited amount of protections beyond this for refugees and displaced persons. So we can look most recently at the protocol relating to the status of refugees, which was agreed upon unanimously by United Nations member states in 1967. And more recently and more contentiously, the Global Compacts for Migration, which were attempted in 2018 and signed by a majority of the world's countries. But the United States, along with about 20 other countries, have decided to stay on the sidelines of the Global Compact. So the Global Compacts were intended to flesh out issues and categories left aside in the protocol relating to refugees, and to establish a number of procedures and policies relating to other types of displaced persons, including internally displaced persons, and controversially those that have been displaced by climate change. So that is something of an abortive process that the United States is still not on side with. So we'll mostly talk about refugees and asylum seekers today. So among migrants, one of the few categories that's afforded protected status under international law is a refugee. So a refugee by definition is an internationally displaced person who is unwilling and unable to return to their home country for fear of persecution on the basis of their religion, their race, social group membership, or political opinion. So in the early conceptualization of the concept of a refugee and what it means to be a refugee, the assumption here was that refugees by and large were individuals who were fleeing political persecution being perpetrated by the governments in their home countries. So as we'll talk about in this lecture, that definition has gotten a lot more complicated, and it's created a lot of wiggle room in terms of individuals who are not so much fleeing persecution by their governments, but fleeing things like gang violence, fleeing things like abusive domestic relationships. Those types of individuals still fall in a legal gray area, and there's a lot of wiggle room for domestic governments to reject those types of claims and sort of play politics with those types of claims. But under international law, refugees are a protected class, who are entitled to non-refoulement. So they cannot be returned to their countries of origin, or they cannot be returned to a place where they're going to be returned to their countries of origin. They're entitled to some level of legal status and some level of due process under the law. And they're also entitled to a blanket amnesty in cases where they've entered their host countries and they're receiving countries illegally. They're entitled to amnesty for whatever illegal actions they took to get to an area where they're able to claim a legitimate grievance or apply for asylum. So countries within this regime are still able to develop their own criteria for determining who qualifies and who does not qualify as a refugee. So the term a lot of you are probably hearing in the media right now is asylum seeker. An asylum seeker is an individual who's made a claim to be treated as a refugee but has not yet been accorded that status by their host country or the country in which their refugee claim is going to be heard. So refugees are a very important topic for Canada and the United States in particular, because Canada happened to be, as of the most recent data, numbers 1 and 2 in the world for receiving and resettling refugees. So Canada, as of 2018, receives the most refugees. The United States receives the second highest number. So refugee politics is of special relevance to North America for this reason, that Canada and the United States disproportionately hear a number of refugee claims and ultimately resettle a disproportionate number of refugees. And it's actually of particular importance to Kentucky because within the United States, Kentucky is one of the top 10 refugee resettling states. So we're ranked number 9 in the country in terms of the number of refugees we take in and we ultimately resettle. So the top 3 countries in terms of where we admit refugees from are the Democratic Republic of Congo, Burma, and Ukraine. You'll notice number 7 on that list is El Salvador. So El Salvador is the largest source of refugees that we get from within the Americas, but still a relatively paltry number of around 725 of the some 20,000 refugees that the United States takes in each year. So we'll talk about the difficulties that Central American migrants have in particular in being able to claim refugee status here in the United States. So globally, the United States still takes in a large number of refugees and ultimately resettles a large number of refugees. Resettlement means refugees are granted a stay in the country on a permanent basis for an indefinite period of time. So we've seen a definite decline under Trump from a high of nearly 100,000 successful claimants during President Obama's last year in office to just 22,000 successful claimants in 2018, which I believe was President Trump's second full year in office. So we have a very steady and a very dramatic trend of declining numbers of refugees under the Trump administration, which was a policy that now President Trump campaigned successfully on. So again, a substantial trend that we've seen under the Trump presidency is a declining number of asylum applications accepted. So at present, the denial rate for asylum applications is around 70%. The denial rate that has been pursued by the Trump administration is especially high for asylum seekers from Mexico and Central America. So the rate is around 90%, near 90% from Mexico, and is near 80% for asylum seekers from Haiti, El Salvador, and Guatemala. Sorry, from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So Mexican asylum seekers and Central American asylum seekers have suffered in particular under the Trump administration, as Trump seeks to tighten the criteria around accepting refugees and asylum seekers. So this can be understood in light of a long history of anti-immigrant sentiment within the United States, dating to at least the end of the Second World War. So you have throughout the United States 20th century history a series of racist anti-American campaigns that have each been quite politically successful, that have made good rhetoric and made for good politics, that have in particular targeted Hispanics as well as American citizens of Mexican and Latino origin. So starting with Operation Wetback in 1954, which was an effort led by Immigration and Naturalization Services to scare Mexican Americans, most of whom who'd entered the country legally, back into Mexico using military measures. And following with this trend of militarization, we had the establishment of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement in 2003, which was established amidst the United States' then global war on terror as a much more militarized deportation force, which at that point had taken over a number of duties that had previously been undertaken by the Immigration and Naturalization Services. So you have Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, joining the trend of an overall militarization of American national security functions following the September the 11th terror attacks. And more recently, you've had a number of laws at the state level which have been overtly racist and overtly directed at immigrants of Mexican and Central American origin. One of the most egregious was implemented in 2010 by Arizona. It required immigrants to carry their documentation or their papers at all times, and authorized state police to stop suspected illegal immigrants and check their papers at will. So this raised a number of very salient and very serious concerns regarding racial profiling. It was something that garnered national attention, but also quite popular within the state, also quite good politics for the governor of Arizona at the time. Following up upon that, in his speech announcing his presidential candidacy on June the 16th of 2015, which is a speech that I'm sure most of you have at this point seen at least bits and pieces of, then presidential candidate Donald Trump referred to Mexican immigrants as quote-unquote rapists and drug smugglers, and he promised to build a wall along the southern border and have Mexico pay for it. So as you all know by now, this was the beginning of a highly successful and effective presidential campaign pursued by now President Donald Trump, and it set out an agenda of cracking down on migration from Mexico and Central America that the Trump administration has largely followed through on, albeit not through building the massive wall that President Trump promised to build, but more through legal means that we'll get into in a few slides. So how has North America's migration regime changed under NAFTA? What kind of changes did NAFTA foster in terms of the migration of citizens between the three countries involved, Canada, the United States, and Mexico? So according to the chapter we read for today, NAFTA has merely served to reinforce pre-existing class, gender, and national inequities and inequalities on migration in terms of unequal access to legal migration. Labor mobility under NAFTA has really only extended to those who work in certain select, privileged, skilled industries. And these individuals are almost exclusively Canadian and American nationals. So NAFTA labor mobility provisions apply almost exclusively to skilled labor. Skilled labor meaning that which requires more than a high school diploma to pursue. So skilled professionals either have at least a college degree or some type of post-secondary certification in a trade or a profession or some type of business category. Within NAFTA, TN provisions allow professionals to work abroad without first having to obtain a visa, and sometimes they're able to do so for an indefinite period of time. Most Mexican workers, sort of within the NAFTA area, to this day, they generally fall into an unskilled category. So they fall in categories like being farm workers and domestic household caregivers. So it's very important to note that unskilled workers are essential to an economy. They're probably more essential than skilled categories. So if you look at our situation right now, a lot of the most essential workers in our economy in the United States right now, as we live through this COVID-19 crisis, are people like delivery drivers, grocery store clerks, pharmacy clerks, who under this categorization would be categorized as unskilled. So it's very important that we don't take unskilled as a synonym for non-essential. It just means that they've received high school training or less to be qualified for the jobs that they're in. And there's also a gender dimension to this. Women in all three countries, women in Canada, the United States, and Mexico, are each more likely to work in unskilled areas of the economy. So here's a table of the flow of NAFTA professionals. By far and away, the really big winners in terms of labor mobility have been Canadian trained professionals like myself, who now work in the United States. So if you want to, if you want a explanation for why I've sounded so pro-NAFTA, why I was so pro-NAFTA in my discussion with Aaron, maybe it's because I'm part of the category that's benefited from labor mobility under NAFTA more than any other category. So by far and away, Canadians who've been educated and trained in Canada and are now able to work in different professions and sectors in the United States have been the really big winners under the new labor mobility provisions under NAFTA. So I myself am within that group. We can look to a second major shift coming about a decade on the heels of NAFTA. Following the 9/11 terror attacks in the United States in 2001. So these were attacks that were perpetrated against New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania. So in the immediate aftermath in 9/11, there were a number of claims in the media that later proved to be false. That at least a few of the 9/11 attackers had initially entered the United States from Canada. So despite these just debunked claims, this led to a general perception that both the northern border, the border between the United States and Canada, and the southern border, the border between the United States and Mexico, that these were both potential areas of vulnerability for American national security. So you've seen an increasing amount of both personnel and security installations and militarization in both borders since 9/11. And you've seen a new approach to how American security personnel, border guards and the like, have dealt with individuals who are screened as potential security risks. Vis-a-vis these individuals, having American citizenship or Canadian citizenship has not, for the most part, provided much protection from screening. Generally speaking, citizenship has taken a backseat to security concerns born out of perceived nationality and perceived religion. So individuals who are perceived as Middle Eastern or perceived as Muslim have, despite being Canadian citizens or American citizens, have been subject to enhanced security and screening protocols. This has especially been a threat to individuals who are dual citizens of Canada and a country in the Middle East, or the United States and a country in the Middle East. So this happened most egregiously and most prominently to a gentleman named Mahar Arar, who was a Syrian-born Canadian citizen, came to Canada as a teenager, gained citizenship in Canada, received training as an engineer in Canada, worked as an engineer in Canada. He was nevertheless, in October of 2003, detained at an airport in the United States and deported to his birth country of Syria, where he remained incarcerated for a year, and he was tortured under a controversial policy of extraordinary rendition. So Mahar Arar was later on granted a formal apology from the Canadian government. This apology came in the year 2007, and he received a cash settlement of some $10 million Canadian that same year. But his detention, nevertheless, was a stark reminder of a number of the changes in the North American security landscape that took place following the 9/11 terror attacks. So how, as a whole, has North America's migration regime changed since 9/11? So 9/11 really brought to the fore a number of long-brewing tensions between neoconservatives and neoliberals in the American national policy establishment. So neoconservatives, think about the inner circle of the George W. Bush administration. Think about individuals like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld. These individuals viewed foreigners by and large as potential terrorists and a threat to national security. You can think of neoliberals as more of the business interests, so people who would represent areas like the hospitality industry in the United States. So actually Donald Trump, the businessman, versus Donald Trump, the president. The chapter mentions Disneyland. So neoliberals have tended to, before 9/11, and still view foreigners as prospective tourists and a source of substantial revenue or potential revenue for the hospitality sector, for the entertainment sector, for various tourist-friendly sectors of the economy. So 9/11 has created a number of tensions between these two actors, and these two actors have struggled for control of the national security agenda since 9/11. The outcome of this struggle is a series of incremental and piecemeal border security initiatives that focus on attempting to use surveillance technology to bridge the gap between neoconservatives and neoliberals in a way that manages risk, that utilizes data, utilizes surveillance to identify and flag potential security risks and potential high-risk individuals without greatly slowing the flow of cross-border traffic. So this is very much a contested and contingent and at times contradictory process. The general branding here has been that of smart borders, so trying to use things like drones, big data, surveillance technology, and the like to leverage these technologies to make borders safer without greatly impeding traffic across borders, which is good for business. So quite controversially, through the 2000s, you've seen the advent of safe third country agreements, which are agreements that the United States has utilized to minimize the number of asylum claims that are launched in the United States. So the very first of these agreements took place between Canada and the United States, and it's been in effect since the year 2004. So asylum seekers who enter a safe third country agreement zone must, by law, per the treaty, file a refugee claim in the country where they first arrive. So failure to do so is grounds for rejection at the border. So under this agreement, if a refugee arrives in the if a migrant arrives in the United States, their obligation is to file an asylum claim within the United States, and if they fail to do so on that grounds, they can get rejected at the United States-Canada border. So this has been in place quite controversially for the past 15 or so years between Canada and the United States. And even more controversially, the United States has used this as a template for agreements that it entered into in Central America's Northern Triangle countries, so the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, in the summer and fall of 2019. So this is part of a longer-run effort, particularly pursued by the Trump administration, to staunch the flow of migrants that have been coming into the United States, the southern border of the United States, often through Mexico, initially from each of these three countries. So let's talk about Central America's Northern Triangle. So this comprises the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. So we tend to think of the United States southern border as an issue that comprises the United States and Mexico, but increasingly you're beginning to see more traffic come in from Central America. And a major driver of this traffic is the fact that Central America and the Northern Triangle in particular is at this point, and has been for the past several years, one of the world's most dangerous regions. So El Salvador in particular has the dubious distinction of being the world's most dangerous country in terms of its homicide rate. So its homicide rate peaked at a number of 100 homicides per 100,000 people during the height of its drug war between 2015 and 2017. It's presently over 50. So we think of the United States as a relatively dangerous country among developed countries, but its homicide rate by comparison is relatively steady at a rate of 5 murders per each 100,000 people. So we're looking at a very dangerous part of the world. And a lot of that danger has been related to gang violence. A lot of that danger is related to drug cartel. That's driving a lot of the migration through Mexico and ultimately into the American southern border. So at present, Mexicans have kind of flatlined as a proportion of the number of asylum seekers and the number of illegal migrants that have been apprehended at the southern border with the United States. Increasingly, migrants who originated from the Northern Triangle of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala are comprising an increasing share of illegal border crossers, an increasing number of asylum claimants in the United States. So it is not an exaggeration and it's not hyperbole to describe the situation in Central America's Northern Triangle as a full-blown migration crisis. However, despite the continued violence in the Northern Triangle, the Trump administration has continually refused to treat Central American border crossers as refugees. So in the summer of 2018, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who was portrayed hilariously by Kate McKinnon on Saturday Night Live, issued a very controversial statement warning that asylum would not be granted on the basis of domestic violence or gang violence, which he called private violence. So again, this gets at the inadequacy of the conventional definition of a refugee as somebody who's facing political violence. That violence, for the most part, in these countries is not being perpetuated by governments, but by private actors, by gangs, and in a number of situations, you have a number of women who are fleeing abusive partnerships. And there's something of a gap in the global jurisprudence and global processing of refugees for those types of situations. So this fervor is not only gripping the United States, but it's also migrated to Mexico. So the next summer, under immense economic and diplomatic pressure from the Trump administration, AMLO in Mexico established a 70,000 member National Guard to secure Mexico's southern border with Guatemala and Belize. And around this same time frame, AMLO scaled back the allocation of humanitarian visas for migrants coming in from the Northern Triangle, and has shifted his rhetoric substantially, no longer viewing this type of migration as humanitarian, using more of an illegal immigration type of framing that we've seen in the United States. So this is not only the United States has turned against Central American migrants, but also Mexico. Mexico, in a way, has become the de facto wall for the Trump administration, in that a number of these border crossers are being stopped at the Mexico-Guatemala border before they even reach Mexico's border with the United States. So just quickly, to bring things to a conclusion, I want to touch on a number of pressures that have been created on the Canada-United States border, in particular since Donald Trump became president. So between February of 2017 and September of 2019, some 50,000 irregular border crossers applied for refugee status from Canada, coming in from irregular ports of entry in the United States. And I apologize for the size of the font, but the largest category of irregular border crossers have come from Nigeria, and they've largely come after Nigeria was placed in the Trump administration's travel ban. The Trump administration has placed a travel ban on a number of countries that are viewed as high-risk countries for terrorism, and high-risk countries for the entry of terrorists into the United States. Nigeria was quite controversially placed on that list, which has spurred a number of irregular border crossings into Canada. And the second highest cohort are migrants who were originally from Haiti. So following the devastating Haitian earthquake in, I believe, 2004, a temporary protected status, sorry, I believe 2006, temporary protected status was implemented for Haitians living and working in the United States. The Trump administration, early on into his presidency, President Trump announced that that legal protection would come to an end for Haitians. So this again led to a flood of Haitians attempting to enter Canada through the United States. So I use this case study to illustrate the true continental nature of North America's migration regime, and a number of implications that immigration policy decisions made under the Trump administration have subsequently had for Canada in terms of placing pressure on the northern border. So that is all I have in terms of this lecture. Stay tuned tomorrow. Tomorrow I will be posting a discussion question on Moodle relating to the readings I've assigned in terms of the book American Dirt and the controversy that the book American Dirt has spurred in various quarters. So keep your eye open for that discussion question. That's coming tomorrow, and I will have you all write a discussion response for Sunday. Those responses are going to be due on Sunday evening at 11:59 p.m. And those responses are going to be the first round of responses that I grade not only as an attendance item, but also for quality. So that will comprise your participation grade. I'll give each post a grade of either excellent, good, or unsatisfactory. So that does it for me. Thank you for your time and your attention. I look forward to reading your responses as the week progresses. Again, please feel free to use the YouTube comments to ask any questions that you have about this lecture. I hope you're all doing well. Have a great afternoon. Bye.